Jono, we all know you very well either way, but can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Jono Bacon, and I run my own consultancy practice, Jono Bacon Consulting, a fairly unimaginative name for a company. And I help companies build communities. I'm really passionate about how we build powerful, engaged, productive communities. So I work with companies to build either external communities around a platform, a service, a product, a developer kind of technology, whatever it might be, but also internal communities, companies that don't go beyond the bounds of or the walls of a company. And that kind of blends into, inner source is very much a part of that, bringing open source principles inside of a company, but also just things like organizational design and running good teams and things like that. I used to be director of community at Canonical, for Ubuntu, at GitHub, at XPRIZE, and yeah, it's kind of my deal.
If you look at your own career graph, you have been a part of the open source community for a very long time. You were involved with the KDE community, then you were part of the Ubuntu community, then you joined XPRIZE, then you joined GitHub, and now you're helping companies in getting engaged with the open source community. So can you talk about your own evolution?
It's been a fun ride. It's funny, I was chatting to someone, I had lunch with someone a couple of days ago, and they were saying how their career is just completely accidental and unintentional. It's just been one thing has led to another. And I feel like I've benefited from the same thing. I started out just being passionate about open source when I discovered it in 1998 and writing for magazines so I could earn some pin money at university. And that just one thing led to another. I worked with a government-funded organization in the UK that helped companies to use and embrace open source, and that was really where I cut my teeth. It was called Open Advantage. And one of the things that there's been a consistent thread through my career, which is I remember the day my brother got me interested in Linux, and I read a book, and the first chapter of the book was about people collaborating electronically, and for some reason it just set a light bulb off in my head. And I've just had this kind of thirst to understand every detail of it. And what I love about it is that it blends technology, psychology, people. I've always been really interested in the people side of things, but really getting stuff done. So one of the things I feel privileged with is that, I feel like I was in the right place at the right time with open source in those early days. And, that's where I met a bunch of people who work in open source. Like I was chatting with someone last night. I was hanging out with Matthew Garrett last night, and him and I have been friends since 2001. And it's like we started out in the same kind of environment. I joined Canonical, I think at a good time. Like Canonical was such a key part of my career. It taught me so much about not just working with communities, but also how to operate in a business, how to deal with an opinionated set of stakeholders, an opinionated set of community members. So, it's been fun. One of the things that was an interesting experience as well was going to XPRIZE. Like, when I went to XPRIZE, a bunch of people, I think we actually did an interview around that time, and I think you said, like, why did you decide to leave open source? And I genuinely didn't even think about that as the optics of it when I went to XPRIZE. But kind of getting out of our world a little bit and seeing a different side of how people work together and collaborate together was really helpful.
What I really wanted to ask was that you are helping companies in building communities. We'll also touch upon the inner source at some point of time. But
Yep.
What I'm really interested in knowing is that when did you learn how to build or how
Right.
to engage constructively?
Again, completely accidental. It was, I think the time when I really started figuring some of this stuff out, the early steps of it was when I heard about open source in 1998 from my brother, and my brother said, why I was moaning about Windows, and my brother said, why are you using a Mickey Mouse operating system like Windows? You should be using Linux, which I think is how a lot of people got started back then. I became captivated by it, and the first thing that I wanted to do was, for a long time, I'd had this kind of element in my personality where when I'm interested in something, I really want to tell other people about it. I want other people to kind of share in my passion with it. So I decided to put together a website called Linux UK. Barely anyone, I didn't know anyone in person that used Linux back then. It was a real, so when I discovered people, or the first time I met someone who was using Linux, it was a real thrill because it's like meeting another member of your tribe. So I wanted to bring people in the UK together around it. And a lot of the stuff that was happening in Linux was really US centric, the major companies were in the US, and there was actually a company in the UK called the Linux Emporium that would import CDs and box sets of the early Linux distros, and and then people would get them and copy them and share them, almost like how people would exchange cassettes for early bands. So I created this website called Linux UK, which was created in Microsoft front page because I didn't know anything about HTML, and people started like using it. And back then I was primarily communicating with people through Usenet. I wasn't really on a many mailing list. There was comp.os.linux.uk, I think it was. So putting together that website and getting a sense of what people wanted to do and how people used it was one of the early things. And then what happened was I've got this thing where once something starts getting like stable and it's working, I tend to lose interest. I'm more interested in doing new things. So as Linux UK formalized and people were reading it a lot, and it was being rebuilt into like more of a PHP kind of like, because it was static. I started losing interest, and another group started taking over Linux UK, and that's when I got interested in KDE, because I was really interested in the client and the consumer side of open source. And joining the KDE community was really where I cut my teeth. That's when I participated. I kicked off I was doing work in the KDE usability study, and I created something called the KDE Enterprise Project. And I was trying to learn C++. I'm not really a very good developer, if I'm being honest. But that's where I really started understanding open source and learning open source. So essentially when I joined Ubuntu, I took a lot of that stuff and brought it to Canonical. And back then, the only way in which you could really participate in open source was if you're a very technical engineer, if you were a programmer. And I was passionate about, well, how do we get people producing icons and doing translations? And that was my major goal when I joined. When I was interviewed by Mark Shuttleworth, the thing he said, like, what do you want to do in Ubuntu? Because Ubuntu was just starting. I said, I want this to be a community where everybody can join, not just programmers. Because back then it was hardcore Debian developers were the bread and butter. So
Ubuntu is one of the largest open source communities, and it's also one of the friendliest ones. Ubuntu established a code of conduct to make it very friendly environment for any user.
Right.
Building such a friendly community also means that you have to work with other people. Somehow you have mastered the art, and now you're teaching other companies how to implement the ideas that you have learned in the process. So I really want to understand your own journey.
Right.
How and when did you learn to work efficiently with other people?
It's weird because, without turning this into a Hallmark Channel biography, I was a bit of an introvert when I was at school, and when it's weird, I had dinner with an old school friend a few weeks ago, and he said, you weren't an introvert at all. You're very much an extrovert. But my memory of that time was being a bit of an introvert. But when I got interested in when I discovered the internet, essentially, and I started communicating with people online, I started becoming a bit more of an extrovert and really enjoy spending time with people. And I think there are just certain people in the world that naturally gravitate towards working with other humans. I think there's some people who gravitate towards working with technology or working with processes. But some people just really enjoy like the people element of things. And I've always I guess I've been like that, but I was a bit of an introvert at school because I was always a little bit nervous of what I was bringing to the table. I didn't think I brought very much. So I don't know where I really kind of learned that. The thing that I've really well, two things. One thing is I really enjoy kind of being thrust into situations where you have to learn on the job. And this is one of the reasons why I've enjoyed consulting, is that a bunch of my clients are asking me how to do things that I'm either fairly new at, or I've some experience but not much experience, because the things that they're doing are brand new. Like I've never seen them done anywhere else before. And obviously some of my clients are doing things where I've done it a ton of times before. And I love those moments where you're learning on the job, where there's a pressure to succeed and you have to be on. But the other thing as well is I'm a big believer that adversity makes people better. Discrimination does not, and people sadly have adversity because they're discriminated against, and that's obviously terrible. But to me, like when you're pushed into a situation where you know it's tough and you've got to deliver something, you know, I think it makes people better at what they do. Like, I didn't study computer science. I kind of picked it up as I went along. So when I joined Canonical, as an example, everybody else who I worked with was a hardcore Debian developer. And I remember the first event that I went to, the first meeting that we had, I was surrounded by these hardcore Debian developers, and they were having conversations. I had no idea what they were talking about. But to me, that's a challenge for me to level up, for me to be better. Not that they need to accommodate me, that I can be better in what I do. And I feel privileged for the fact that I've been thrust into those situations and I've been able to succeed in it. And I think that's helped me to kind of learn how to work with people.
But when you work with these companies, I'm sure that a lot of these companies are not exposed to open source. So what I want to talk about is inner source,
Yeah.
where these companies have their own internal silos, where either different departments or different units or different employees or people don't actually interact with each other. And when you work with these companies, what are the common challenges or what are the common problems that you see across the board?
The inner source thing has been fascinating. It's become like a big chunk of my business because I think it typically boils out of digital transformation. It's a company is usually a large company. They've been successful in the marketplace, but they've got competition that's particularly new competition and younger companies who are giving them a bit of a run for their money. And they realize we have a stodgy, slow, inefficient culture and we need to improve that. The misnomer about inner source is that it's about building code, and it really isn't. Inner source is a cultural challenge, and it's about building a new culture. So what happens typically, from my experience, and I've worked with various companies who have done this, and they're all big companies, is you get someone on the executive team, whether it's a CIO or it's a CEO, whether it's, you know, a VP or an SVP, and they say, we want to kick off an internal inner source or a digital transformation initiative. And those people typically don't know how to accomplish that. They understand the value that they can drive. They can understand the value of collaboration in open source, but they have no idea how to implement that. So the first thing I like to do is to ensure that we build out a permissive culture. You cannot build inner source in a company unless you have an executive team that support that, because it's going to have people operating in different ways. But then you can't just give it all this. Like, a lot of consultants go into companies and they talk the talk, and then it lasts a year, and all the employees think, you know what, this person's going to be around for a year, they'll do nothing, and then we'll be on to the next gimmick. And we see this all the time. So to me, what you have to do is you have to put in all of the ground level pieces. You've got to deploy your GitHub or your GitLab. You've got to have all of the onboarding for how people use those. You've got to have transparency of how the communities are working. You've got to have communities around topic areas such as blockchain or agile or whatever it might be. But then you've also got to have technology software components, almost like an internal Apache. So the thing I find fascinating about inner source is it's a hard environment to build a community. It's kind of like it's a boot camp. It's American Ninja for how to build a community. It's way more complicated than building an external community, because you're fundamentally working in a world that is used to a very different way of working. And one of the things I think we forget in the open source world is, like, you come to the Open Source Summit and we talk about things like they're completely normal. We talk about continuous delivery and deployment and peer review, like just collaboration around peer review in an open online setting. For a lot of companies that haven't done this before, that's weird. Like, one of my clients, big company in China, the idea of collaborative peer review, where your colleagues are reviewing you in an open setting where other managers can read it, is an unnerving prospect. So the way in which you accomplish that is not through just the technology, putting the tools in place, but it's giving people the confidence. I'll give you one small example. There was one manager at a company I was working with, and one of the things I always do, step one, when we start these initiatives, is to kick off a weekly report where everybody can just see what's going on, and people volunteer to get the report, and then a monthly office hours session, which is a webinar that everybody can tune into, and just start disseminating information. One of the things I asked this manager to do was to create, to share some recent work that's been going on with each of these weekly reports. And he was really unnerved because he was like, I'm worried, it's going to make my team look bad, that I'm not doing enough good stuff. So I sat down with him and I helped him to formulate that. Well, think about all these great things that you're doing. You might not have delivered this thing yet, but the way you're building the team, the way you're training the team, that's all good stuff. And then he saw that weekly report as an opportunity to shine, as opposed to an opportunity to be, kind of dismissed. So there's a ton of nuance, but for me that's really exciting because it again, it's like it's pushing me into a very constrained environment. It forces me to be better at what I'm doing.
As you work with these different companies of different sizes, they also have different levels of management: the top level, middle managers, and then you have developers. So which of these three levels pose biggest challenges to you?
Middle managers. The biggest challenge is middle managers, because, and I understand why, and it's not a slam against middle managers, is at the executive level, executives are fundamentally trained and operate at a broader business value perspective. They're looking at, they're looking 5 years ahead. Where is the market opportunity where we should be going, and what is the value that we want to derive? People on the ground, engineers, community managers, stuff like that, work on a very tactical level. So they are doing stuff like executing, getting things done. They're judged on, in many ways, very tangible results. Like, did you achieve this specific goal? Middle managers are in a really awkward position because they have to internalize the requirements of their senior management, and they have to, convert those requirements into things that their teams can work on, which is complicated. But also, a lot of middle managers are a bit insecure in their position in a company. So you often get a lot of kind of like micromanagement and land grabbing, and particularly with something like inner source or digital transformation, when you're doing something completely new, people can be can be freaked out. And in some industries, such as financial services, which are very financially driven, some people can also worry about losing their bonuses to other people as well. So I spend, a lot of my time when I work with these companies with the middle management layer, not in a, well, it's just another middle manager and they just need to fall in line, but more of a helping them to, without sounding patronizing, helping them to understand the opportunity available to them. Because I think when people feel like they understand the opportunity and how they can harness it, then they're in more control of their own domain, and then you get better results.
These companies also consume a lot of open source. So how do you build the bridge between inner source and external open source projects so that they also become active contributors to those projects to ensure that the projects they rely on are sustainable?
That's an awesome question, and I think it's one of the when I kick off these early conversations with new clients around inner source, and it's usually, like I say, with like a CIO or like one of the execs who are triggering these projects, because obviously these inner source initiatives, they require funding, internal funding. So there's usually a kind of a champion for it. One of the things I say to them is, they're invariably looking at it very much from the perspective of just optimizing internally. But one of the things I say to them is, another benefit that you get of this is if you do this well, you're equipping the company for working with the external world. So, as we all know, companies who use lots of companies use open source, but they do not contribute to open source. So they pull this in, and then there'll be a pressure to somehow work externally with people because they want to accomplish something, or they've built something, they want to share it back. That's very difficult to do unless you have a compatible set of tools and process. So, for example, if you have a company that's never worked with open source and they pull in, Drupal, and they want to contribute something back to the Drupal project, invariably, technically, it's not that big of a deal because your engineers often are working on open source projects externally. Where you face an issue is typically with management and with legal. So when you start building those internal inner source processes, and you're working on asynchronous workflow and you're doing peer review, then interfacing that externally becomes a lot more simple. The one thing I would say is I think there is more opportunity than I've ever seen before for building communities and ecosystems. And one of the things I see all the time is, I think, and I talked about this in my keynote this week at the Open Source Summit, is I think companies more than ever are seeing the value proposition for this. And not just in open source, but we're seeing, we've seen Harley Davidson with their owners group, SAP with their community network, Procter & Gamble with their kind of teenage girls community that they've built, H&R Block. We've seen lots and lots of examples of non-tech companies wanting to build ecosystems and communities. And I think that provides a great opportunity, but I think it also means that the community management world needs to up its game. And I mentioned this in my keynote. Like, I know some wonderful community managers who do great work, but a lot of it's very tactical. It's very much around blogging and social media and stuff like that. And I've been saying for a long time now, to me, it's a journey. We have to, in my mind, the real role of a community manager is to understand the opportunity for a community and to help build an environment and an experience that helps a community member to be successful. And I think that requires a lot of strategy, a lot of tactics, and just a lot of soul searching in terms of trying things and seeing if they work well and embracing failure and then, making better decisions based upon that. But to me, there's never been a better time than now for doing this.
One question that I want to ask, and it also depends on your personal opinion about this topic, is diversity. This is a topic that's very close to my heart. So when you talk to these companies, and once again, it depends on your own personal take, but I am assuming that you do support diversity. A lot of time, people misunderstand diversity. It's cultural sensitivity. It's a lot of different things. So when you talk to these companies, do you also help them in creating an environment that is inclusive? I mean, when we talk about diversity, it's not about creating quotas. What you're doing is that you are creating an environment so that different group of people can come into the room and sit down and have active discussions, dialogues, and participation.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's interesting. There's been, obviously, without a shadow of a doubt, like diversity. There's like a political correctness around diversity that a lot of people talk about, and to me, it's not. Yes, that's interesting, but to me, the real reason why diversity is important is it's not just the right thing to do. You just get better results. Right, it's been proven time and time again that when you have a more diverse community, more diverse company, you just do better. It's more rewarding for your employees. It's a safer, more fulfilling environment, and you get better results. So to me, it's just a given, and it's not something that should be ignored. The thing is, I think a lot of the conversation around diversity tends to anchor around gender and race and sexuality and things like that, and that's again a given. We should be building environments where everybody's welcome. But I also think that something that isn't talked about as much is diversity of ideas and approaches. And a lot of the work that I work on is building an environment where, not just where we can make sure that everybody's welcome and everybody has an opportunity to succeed. And I think things like, confirmation bias and the unintentional biases that we tend to have in the way that we engage and embrace people, and just accept that everybody is discriminating in some form or capacity, like it's just part of human beings. Like obviously, just being honest about those things and helping people to not delve into those rabbit holes where people, think, oh, I don't discriminate against anyone. I treat everybody equally. It's like, that's not true. Okay. Like everybody's got something like that. And we need to be aware of that and deal with that and help people to be more successful. But I think a chunk of this as well is building an environment where people can bring different ideas and different approaches and work well together. And one of the things that bothers me in the world today, and I think the current political climate is an example of this, is that I think we're seeing a culture of people be more interested in being right than exploring other people's ideas. And to me, without sounding like a self-help preacher, the most thrilling times in life are when you discover that you had it wrong, because it's a clue for how to do things better. So what happens, I think we're seeing this with our current political discourse, where you get people on the left wing and the right wing, and they're just arguing and fighting all of the time, as opposed to, look, there are good choices and bad choices on both sides of the equation. I've always been very much down the middle. So I think what I try to do is to build an environment with these companies where people are encouraged to challenge each other, but also to accept failure, to say, yeah, I was wrong about that, and that's good, because I don't have to worry about that again. Like, I can now I've got a clue about how to go in the right kind of direction. That's complicated in a lot of corporate environments where people are very self-conscious about looking silly or looking, like they've got it wrong, or they're worried about their job security if they screw up. So a big chunk of this is not just talking the talk about embracing failure. but actually, really focusing on that. And to do that, you have to build an environment where you can bring a diversity of ideas and perspectives, many of which will be contrary to each other. So to me, it's building an environment where men, women, trans people, people of all different colors, people of all different sexualities, political persuasions, whatever it might be, everybody's got a chance to succeed, but also a chance to debate and disagree with each other respectfully and see value in each other's differing perspectives as well. And it's hard to do that, but to me, it all stems from leadership. Like your leaders have to lead by example. If you have people who hide their failures, or people who don't treat people equally, then it cascades down. Whereas if you have leaders who, like, I'll give you an example. One of my clients made a terrible mistake in a project and made a bad choice, and it set everything back. And we had a meeting, and I said to him, he was like, he said, I don't know what to do here. And I said, you know what I do? We'll organize one of our office hours. We'll pull everybody in the company together. It's about 400 or 500 people in this company. And just go out there and say, you know what, everyone? I got it wrong. And I'd love some feedback on how to do that better. And the response was overwhelming. It was like so much support. A lot of people who I heard secondhand said, that was really cool that he did that. And we need more of that, I think.